Well, it's good to see everybody tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about part 2 of the 4-part series on the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. And while last month we talked about, the startup to the Revolutionary War. That's all that dry history stuff. From here on out, we're going to be talking about fun stuff, folks. I'm here to tell you. But it is necessary that you know about first contact with the Native Americans, 1523. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon sailed into Winyah Bay, which is where Georgetown is, and interacted with the Winyah Indians there, invited 60 of them aboard his ship, and promptly pulled up anchor and sailed down the Caribbean and sold those individuals into slavery. And that was the first contact that Native Americans in South Carolina had with European culture. But almost worse than hauling those 60 folks off for a lifetime of slavery was the fact that when the Spaniards came through South Carolina, they did leave behind the European diseases. And at time of first contact, there were 10 million Native Americans in America. At the time of the Revolutionary War, there were 1 million Native Americans in America. 90% death rate due to European diseases, and this is primarily smallpox. In 1715, there was a Yamasee War between the Yamasee tribes, confusing time. That Indian uprising was always on the minds of the colonial government, as well as the Stono Rebellion in 1739, when that was a slave revolt, where 50 slaves revolted and 25 of their owners were killed, and then all 50 of the revolting slaves were killed as well. In 1755, the Treaty of Saluda was signed, and that was the time when the 96th District, which is 10 westernmost counties in South Carolina, they became sold by the Cherokees to the British colonial government, and that was an effective treaty that did last for 22 years. In 1754, the French and Indian War started. It really heated up in 1758 here in South Carolina, and there was a terrible conflict with the Cherokees, and that was the first Cherokee War, or the Anglo-Cherokee War. And it was a terrible massacre of the Cherokees. They were shot on sight. Their fields were burned. Their pigs and cattle were slaughtered. Their orchards were chopped down. Their houses were burned. And that ended in 1761. 1760s, the regulator movement started in the backcountry of South Carolina because it was a lawless setting here. And the regulators were a vigilante group that took the law into their own hands and very effectively controlled vagabonds traveling through, highway robbers, horse thieves, and that sort of thing. And their method of punishment was tying somebody up to a tree and whipping them. And that's what the regulators did. But like all vigilante movements, it got out of hand, and a group rose in opposition to the regulators called the moderators. And there was almost a war between the regulators and the moderators. It was that serious, but that was diffused, and as a result of that, the 96th District was created when a courthouse and jail was built in the hamlet of 96, which is on the Cherokee path between Charleston and Kiowee, which was the Cherokee capital. We'll be talking about this much more. But you need to be up to date and up to speed on the history as things happened. Gradually, the colonial government was tightening the screws on trying to raise taxes in South Carolina, and there was resistance. There was huge resistance in Boston. There was huge oppression in Boston. The British forces moved their troops into the homes of the Boston residents. And, you know, they were wanting to collect harbor taxes and all that sort of thing. The Revolutionary War started in Boston. It was very oppressive there. It wasn't nearly as oppressive in South Carolina. There were very few British officials here. It was more a problem of establishing order in South Carolina. And that's the point at which I'm going to start tonight's lecture. But I did want to talk a little bit about the terms that I use. Now, who do we call these people who hate the king and want to live separately from him? And at the time, those particular individuals did not know what name to call themselves. And it evolved upon themselves that more than likely they began to call themselves Whigs. And Whigs are a political party in Britain that believed in a king, but they wanted a constitutional monarchy. And they were opposed by a political party in England called the Tories. And the Tories wanted an absolute monarchy. So this was a conflict that was happening in England, and to a minor degree, it kind of spilled over into America. But the people in opposition started referring to themselves as Whigs. We don't use that term anymore. They also referred to themselves as rebels, and they referred to themselves as associators, because they wanted to associate with other colonies that were here in the Western Hemisphere. See, England had a policy where they dealt with each of their 25 colonies separately. They had a separate law in Boston. And then if they wanted to, they could use those same laws and apply them in South Carolina. They had to rewrite the thing. They had individual relationships with 25 colonies in the Western Hemisphere. See, we've got our 13 that rebelled, but there were 12 colonies that did not rebel. And these were 5 in Canada, 5 in the Caribbean, and East Florida and West Florida. And Florida was a real thorn in the side for the Patriot forces throughout the American Revolution. So the word patriot was not used by the Patriots to a large extent. I've read 4 times in George Washington's letters where he does use the word patriot. But the use of that word didn't come in until about 30 years after the war, when all the newspaper writers and everything would refer to this as patriots. If you want to talk about patriots, talk about the people who were loyal to their country. That's what a patriot is. And the people that we call the loyalists were loyal to their country, which was very patriotic in their mind in particular. But I use the term rebels. I use the term patriot because that's what people know what I'm talking about when I say that. So the patriots were in opposition to the loyalists here in America who were loyal to the king. They're also referred to as kingsmen. Now, if there was a loyalist who was a particularly bad guy who did things out of the norm, beyond the pale, that guy was a Tory. So when you hear Tories or loyalists or kingsmen, you know what we're talking about then. So I primarily use the term patriots and loyalists, and if it's a bad guy, I'll say Tory. So that brings us to law and order in the Carolina backcountry. And there was very little. Again, and this is 96. This is the hamlet of 96. They had a grand total of 12 houses in 96, and it was the most prosperous community in the backcountry. And it's because of the trade with the Cherokees on the Cherokee Path. This is the jail in 96. It was the grandest structure in the backcountry. It was 3 stories tall. It was built of brick, which was amazing. They would have tourists come into 96 just to stare at that brick 3-story structure. And the courthouse was brick as well. This is very misleading. There was not plank lumber in the backcountry during this time. To get a house like this lumber would have had to been imported from Charleston, which is something they just wouldn't do. The structures, the backcountry structures, were log cabins, and they were log cabins with dirt floors. So, I mean, it was very primitive, and I'm going to be focusing a little bit on how primitive things were. But I did want to show you this picture of 96. It's a somewhat typical scene. Here's David Fanning right here, chained in the attic of the jail. He escaped. The first time he was put in that jail, he was put in trial by his peers, and David Fanning was a Tory, but half the backcountry was loyalist, and half the backcountry was patriot. And Daniel Fanning was charged with treason for being a Tory during this time when the Patriot forces dominated 96. Well, the first time he was put in that jail, he was found innocent, and so he was let go. The second time he was put in that jail, one of his friends brought 2 files, and he took one of the files and he hid it, and he took the other file and he saw his way through the window, then he got out. He was arrested again and thrown back in jail. He found his file, he saw that through a window again, he got out, he escaped. He was arrested the 4th time, and here he is put in the attic, of that jail right there. So he's chained to the floor. He does break loose his chain right there, and the jailer knew it, but he knew that he was tied up the way he was, chained up the way he was. There was a trap door in the floor of the attic, so that, you know, there was a post that was blocking the trap door. So when you take the post out, the door swings down. But you put it up and you put the post back, and there's no way you can get through that door from up. So what he did was he broke loose where he was bolted to the floor, and then he proceeded to go through the chimney. And he came down the chimney and then busted out the outside of the chimney and got away that way. And he went to North Carolina, where he commanded a regiment of 900 other Tories. David Fanning was a very influential loyalist officer. I wanted to talk to you about the weaponry that was utilized in the Revolutionary War and how this weaponry affected battle outcomes, battle tactics, how men did things in the heat of battle during the Revolutionary War. So this is a rifle. This is a handmade, or a representation of a handmade rifle that was used in the backcountry throughout the United States, or the colonies at that time. Pennsylvania long rifle. Some people call it Kentucky long rifle, but there wasn't such a thing as Kentucky during this time. No 2 rifles were ever the same. It fired rifle balls, which were homemade, handmade out of lead. There were several advantages, some advantages to using a rifle in Revolutionary warfare. The biggest advantage was this rifle right here was accurate to 200 yards. The groove, the barrel was grooved so that it had, it was rifled, so that as the ball went through, it started to spin, and that spin gave it accuracy, as opposed to a musket who fired an undersized ball through a tube, so to speak, and a musket ball came out like a knuckleball. And it was only accurate to 80 yards, whereas these rifles were accurate to 200 yards. But rifles had numerous disadvantages. One of them, that it took an entire minute to load and fire this rifle. You had to You had to take, uncap your powder horn. You had to fill the little case right there. We're drawing a blank on the name.
Pan.
Pan, thank you. We have an expert over here. What's making that noise?
I'm not sure what's that.
I don't guess it matters. But, so you load the pan with the powder, and then you close the pan, you lock that, you take your ball, and you shut it down the barrel with your ramrod, which is here, and you have to pour the powder in first, then you have a patch that removes the air pockets and so forth, ram that ball in there, then aim, then fire. That takes a minute to do that while you've got people shooting at you. So that's a real disadvantage for a rifle. Another real disadvantage is the fact that it uses black powder. And black powder fouls more fiercely than anything else. You could only shoot this rifle 4 times in battle before the barrel was fouled so much you had to stop and take 15 minutes to clean it out. Every successive ball that you shot out of this had to be smaller than the one previous, because that's how much debris was left in these rifle barrels. So it had the advantage of being a sniper's weapon, but in the heat of battle, it was not an effective tool. This is a much more effective tool in the heat of battle, and this is the British Brown Bess musket right here. And it has a huge technological advantage over a rifle, and that's in the fact that it has a pre-built paper cartridge. And those British soldiers would use their cartridge box, and they were able to load 16 paper cartridges in their cartridge box. 4 rows of 4. They take the cartridge out, they bite the tip off, they pour a little bit down in the pan, cock it. These were incredibly primitive weapons. They depended on a piece of rock striking a piece of steel to create a spark, which would ignite the flash pan, which would then ignite the powder inside the barrel. And with all of that, think of how many things can go wrong in that process. In the meantime, your life is dependent upon how fast you get that thing loaded. If it's windy, that blows your powder out of the flash pan. If it's raining, your powder will ignite. So the primitiveness of these weapons is astounding to me. This is before the age of bullets. These are balls, no percussion caps here. This shows 6 steps involved in loading and firing a musket. You can fire a musket every 20 seconds versus every 60 seconds for a rifle. But with all of that, it's not the musket that's the most valuable and feared weapon on the battlefield. It's not the musket, it's not the rifle. It's this right here. This is the bayonet. The bayonet was the most feared weapon on the battlefield. And it's because you can get a whole series of soldiers like this charging bayonet. Here, the opposing forces, the Patriots, have fired their volley, and they got this guy right here. But all of these folks now are coming full speed at these guys, and they have unloaded weapons. So what do? You do not stand up to that. And this has been the difference in victories in numerous of the set piece battles. Now there's, Francis Marion was so famous for his ambushes and so forth. He did not have set piece battles until the Battle of Eutaw Springs, when he commanded the militia there, who were armed with muskets at this time and could trade shot for shot with the British regulars at Eutaw Springs. Cavalry cavalry did not use guns. Here's a guy, I just had this to show you how awkward it is to shoot a carbine, which is a shortened rifle, from a moving horse. You can't do that, and it's inaccurate to begin with. So the preferred weapon for the cavalry was the sword. And this is one of my favorite scenes. This is the end of the Battle of Cowpens, when William Washington, our hero here, is chasing down Banastre Tarleton, who is leaving the field of battle. Washington saw 3 officers leaving the battle as the British were retreating, and Washington turned to his men and he says, "Come on guys, let's go get him." And so they started following after those 3 officers. Well, William Washington was getting further and further and further ahead, and this fella is believed to be Banastre Tarleton. He turned and he saw that Washington was outrunning his support. So he turned around immediately and started a major sword fight with William Washington, breaks Washington's sword at the hilt. And here Cornet Patterson is just in the midst of chopping off William Washington's head, when a waiter, too small to wield a sword, and you can tell this is Washington's bugler, because there's his bugle right there. 14 years old. This fellow is described in 2 different battle scenes. One of them at Hammond's Old Store. One of them is here at Cowpens. In both cases, he's described as a 14-year-old individual with puny arms. Too small to wield a sword. That's the only reason that William Washington would allow him to have a pistol. And here he's shooting his pistol, and he wounds Cornet Patterson, saving William Washington's life. And Banastre Tarleton turns and rides off into the sunset, even though it was early morning at this time. Cavalry fought with swords. Many of you know I'm the caretaker at Hammond's Old Store, battlefield, 3 miles south of Clinton. That's when the battle occurred 18 days before this battle. And William Washington and 80 dragoons, along with 200 local militia riflemen, attacked 250 Tories who had broken for lunch. And they had their arms stacked. And William Washington charged as soon as he saw them and slashed those men until there was 150 killed and wounded. 40 captured, 60 escaped to fight the next day. But it's swords. This is the primitive nature of Revolutionary War activity. Is the sword was the weapon for the cavalry. The sword and the horse, the mass and speed of the horse made a huge difference as well. So here you have militiamen loading a rifle. And another disadvantage to a rifle is the fact that you have to load it while you're standing up. You can't lie on the ground and you have to be behind a tree. You can load a musket by lying on your back on the ground, but you can't do that with a rifle. So these militiamen, are they loyalists or are they patriots? No, you can't tell. You cannot tell. And in battle, you could not tell who was a loyalist or who was a militiaman. And there's just example after example about people getting away because they claim to be, the friend rather than the foe. At Kings Mountain, the way that the patriots identified themselves was they put a piece of white paper in their hats. And the loyalist militiamen at Kings Mountain put a pine twig in their hats. And so that was their uniform. A white piece of paper or a twig. Now, there are several different classes of fighters in the Revolutionary War. And I just showed you a picture of the militiamen who were on both sides. And these were homesteading farmers who signed up for a 30, 60, 90-day period, and then they were going home. They did not like to go far from their home because they were worried about robbers who would be coming through, Cherokees who would be attacking, or what have you. Regular soldiers did not think highly of militia. The British officers and the American officers both thought there were times they would just soon not have the militia around in the way. Now later on, the militia, as the war progressed, became more and more professional and adept, and in many cases, they made all the difference. But this is a loyalist who is serving in the British Army versus a loyalist who's a militia. And these loyalists here are referred to as provincials. You'll hear me talking about provincials. Provincials are Americans who are trained in the British manner. They serve in the British manner. They fight in the British manner. Their uniforms are in the British manner. So when the provincials, and when Charleston fell and the British did come into Charleston and so forth, the state of South Carolina, there were a number of provincials, and most of these were from New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Had been fighting up there in the north, and when Clinton brought his 8,000 men down to South Carolina, he had a number of provincials with him. And provincials had a primary role in the backcountry of South Carolina. There were only 3 British regular officers in the backcountry of South Carolina. This is until Tarleton came in at the Blackstocks. But Patrick Ferguson, who led the Loyalists at Kings Mountain, Nisbet Balfour, and Alexander Ennis were English and Scottish-born officers in the British Army. Those are the only ones who were in the backcountry of South Carolina. This is a provincial, and they played an important role. These are continental soldiers, American official. They sign up for at least a year. South Carolina was required to provide a quota of continental soldiers. And these fellows signed up for at least 1 year or 2 year or a 3-year period. And they were paid in land that was given to them right here in Pickens County. A fellow signed up for the Continental Army. He could serve for a year, and after his year was up, he was given 100 acres right here, 100 acres and a slave. If he signed up for 3 years, he got 300 acres and three slaves. But the Continental Army in South Carolina primarily defended Charleston, and we'll be talking about that. Blue uniforms provided by the French. We didn't have any factory in America making those uniforms. These came from the French. And I'll be talking about the French importance later on as well. Some artillery involved, some limited use of artillery, and the longer the war went on, the more artillery got in the field. There wasn't a lot of artillery in the backcountry of South Carolina during the American period, and I should have started with this. There are 2 periods in South Carolina that are important in understanding how this war was fought. The first 5 years was referred to as the American period. That's from 1775 to 1780. There were no British officers in South Carolina, British soldiers, during that time, even though the British tried to take Charleston with the Battle of Sullivan's Island in 1776. Other than that, no British. All the fighting was between Americans, Native Americans, and Loyalists versus Patriots. But there was limited artillery, and this piece of artillery here is referred to as a grasshopper. It's a 3-pound cannon, and every time it fired, it jumped back. You had to reload it, and there would be like 14 or 15 men manning a gun like this. So you know, small caliber, I mean, a ball is only about that big on a 3-pound grasshopper. Its most effective weapon was shooting buckshot or grape shot. And you get about 20 balls about that big coming out of the mouth of that cannon at you, and you think twice before you charge into that. The 3-pound grasshopper was active, accurate up to 1,000 yards. A 6-pound cannon, which was twice as heavy and twice as difficult to maneuver around, would go with accurate 1,200 yards. And a 12-pound cannon, even more cumbersome still, was effective to 1,400 yards. So you don't gain much advantage at all by having a 6-pounder over a 3-pounder. So 3-pounder, these were the guns. You could break them apart and put them in the back of a wagon if you had to. So this is how they were maneuvered. And here's a cannon in action at the Battle of the Orchard Crest subdivision. You can just see the grave right here. That was a restoration project that we had, restoring the graves of John Thomas Jr. and his wife, Jane Black Thomas, who are Revolutionary War heroes and heroines. And I'll be talking about it a little bit later on. This is in Greer off of Highway 101. This is where the developer bulldozed the graveyard and he got the story. So, that sort of sets the stage a little bit for what did happen once armed conflict began. And while the Revolutionary War did start in Boston, in New England, the second place where it occurred was here in South Carolina. And this is 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence. The first armed conflict that occurred in the state was on June 11, 1775, at Fort Charlotte. In 1768, the British basically closed their forts in South Carolina because the South Carolinians weren't contributing to the upkeep of their forts, and because New York was getting a little bit antsy up there. So the garrison at Fort Prince George was removed and sent to New York. And there were some other forts around in the backcountry as well. I'm not sure which, there were lots of private forts. And at this point, I'm not sure what was a colonial fort or a private fort, but Fort Charlotte was a colonial fort, and it was, as far as I know, the last official British colonial fort in the backcountry. And the British consolidated all the weapons from their other forts into Fort Charlotte. And what they had there was 18 swivel guns. I didn't show you a picture of that, but a swivel gun is a little cannon about this big with a 1-inch bore. You can load that with rocks and nails and stuff, so forth. And it was a naval gun to begin with, but you could turn it, aim it, you could aim it anywhere you wanted to, and that's another thing you would not want to charge into. And it was used for defensive purposes in so many of the forts and the bastions. So the Council of Safety in Charleston issued a command to James Mason, who was in charge of the militia in the back country at that time, to take Fort Charlotte. Now, some reports I read say that, there was a commander there with 15 men, and another report I've read says that there was a commander there with his wife and 5 children. But anyway, when James Mason and the Patriots arrived at the fort, the fellow gave up without a fight. He may have been a sympathizer, who knows? But anyway, that was a major haul when that fort was taken. There were 18 swivel guns in there, 1,000 pounds of gunpowder, all sorts of shot and balls and other accoutrements necessary for the continuance of war. So, Fort Charlotte was kind of taken without any issue whatsoever, but again, it was an armed conflict. The first shots fired in the Revolutionary War happened in Charleston Harbor when the British colonial governor, William Campbell, was run out of office, and he went to the warship Tamar, which was anchored in Charleston Harbor. That's where he had his sanctuary. And if he had wanted to, he could have sailed around Hog Island and gone up the Cooper River and the Wando River and met with loyalists in that area and given them support and that sort of thing. So to prevent that from happening, the Council of Safety at this time had their batteries along the Charleston Harbor, and they could control that entrance into Wando and Cooper Rivers, except that if the British went around Hog Island, then they had clear sailing. So the Council of Safety decided to sink 4 ships in that channel to block it off, and they had sunk 3 of them and were in the process of sinking the 4th when the Tamar came around the bend and saw what they were doing and started firing shots. And that was the first shots in South Carolina during the Revolution. Well, there was a lot of tension in the backcountry during this time. The Drayton, Tennant, and Hall Commission trying to sign up people for the association, trying to sign up Patriot Associators. What they did was they absolutely identified who was in favor of the king and who was opposed to king. So now, all of a sudden, everybody knows who the leaders of the 2 groups are and everything. And the Council of Safety decides it would be a real good idea if they imprison the loyalist leaders in the backcountry. So they began to do that. The Council of Safety was an extra-legal body, an extra-legal committee, self-appointed, had declared martial law. They had dictatorial powers. So they start arresting the loyalist leaders in the backcountry, one of whom is Robert Cunningham. And Robert Cunningham lived on the Saluda River between the border of Lawrence County and Greenwood County. And he had a ford right there where his plantation was, called Peach Hill. This is under Lake Greenwood now. But that was a major crossing point across the Saluda, and Robert Cunningham was a very resourceful and wealthy man. His brother, Patrick, was wealthier. He was the wealthiest individual in that part of the 96th district. Charles Moore with the Walnut Grove Plantation in Spartanburg County was another very wealthy, influential. But Patrick Cunningham was the largest slaveholder in Lawrence County, which is called the Little District River at that time. The Little River District, excuse me. He had 40 slaves. Robert Cunningham was a slaveholder. But these were the 2 most ardent loyalists in the backcountry. And later on, after Charleston fell, Robert Cunningham was made the general of the loyalist militia. So just 25 miles from here is where the leading loyalist in the state resided. But Robert Cunningham got captured, and he got sent down to Charleston and thrown in jail there, along with Richard Paris from downtown Greenville, where the Reedy River Falls is. That's where Paris had his plantation illegally in Cherokee territory. He was a friend of the Cherokees. Richard Paris got arrested over that, but the name of the property was put in his Cherokee half-son named George. Anyway, those 2 individuals were put in jail in Charleston. So Patrick Cunningham, Robert's brother, raises a force of 200 men. And he's going to go down to Charleston to rescue his brother. At the same time, the Council of Safety was sending a wagon load of shot and powder to the Cherokees. And this is in November of 1775, 7 months before the Declaration. So the reason that the Council of Safety was wanting to send shot and powder to the Cherokees was this was one of the unofficial terms of the Treaty of Saluda that the colonial government would give the Cherokees in the town of Kiowee 1,000 pounds of powder and 2,000 pounds of shot every fall, so that the Cherokees could have their fall hunt. They were giving arms and ammunition to the Cherokees, which everybody was fine with, because that meant the Cherokees were harvesting the deer and sending the deer skins back into Charleston. There were 50,000 deer skins a year that sailed out of Charleston Harbor. So that was a valuable trade situation between the Cherokees and the settlers, and it was to some extent a love-hate relationship, because there were problems, as you know, but this trade was a valuable thing. And so the Council of Safety wanted to continue that trade in order to curry the favor of the Cherokees. The Cherokees at this time were 16,000 strong. They had 6,000 gunmen. So as Patrick Cunningham and his 200 men are going down the Cherokee Path to Charleston to save Robert Cunningham, they come across this wagon train of shot and powder guarded by 25 men. This is at Mine Creek, 18 miles below 96. And Patrick Cunningham decides he's going to do the next best thing rather than save his brother, because he never could have done that anyway. So he captures the wagon train. And he takes it into the hamlet of 96. Well, this creates an absolute uproar in the backcountry, and Patriot forces start collecting. And the leader of these Patriot forces is Andrew Williamson. You remember this name. Andrew Williamson built Fort Charlotte. He was an entrepreneur. He was a very self-made man, a rough character. Andrew Williamson could not read and write. He started as an overseer on the plantation. We think he had a plantation in Greenwood County on Hard Labor Creek. But he was the leader in the backcountry. And I described you as, of course, Andrew Williamson hated Cherokees. He absolutely hated Cherokees. But he collected a group of 400 militiamen. See, Andrew Williamson was senior. Andrew Pickens was his second in command. Andrew Williamson was senior to Sumter and Marion during this time period. So he was the man. He collects 450 men, and he surrounds Patrick Cunningham and his men at 96. But the loyalist leaders in the backcountry, they are incensed and motivated as well, and they gather an army of 1,900 men. And now they're surrounding Andrew Williamson, and he's stuck. Council of Safety's not going to put up with 1,900 loyalists loose in the backcountry, so they raise an army of 3,000 from the Camden and Orangeburg area, joined by 750 North Carolinians. So now this group, under the command of 71-year-old Richard Richardson, with second in command, Major Danger Thompson. That's another name to remember. Major Danger Thompson from Orangeburg. He's second in command to Richard Richardson. Richard Richardson is South Carolina royalty. He had 4 grandsons who were governors of the state of South Carolina, and he had 1 great-grandson who was governor. He did not live out the war though. He got captured when Charleston fell, and he got treated rough during the prison experience. And right before he died, he got sent home, and so he died at his place near Camden. They say that shortly thereafter, Bannister Tarleton came through and had a rumor that the family silver and gold was buried with Richard Richardson. So Tarleton dug up the body, checked it out, there wasn't any gold there. They left the body and rode on. Next day, he fought at the Battle of the Waxhaws. But anyway, Richardson now is leading a force of 4,000 men, and he comes to break the siege at 96. This is a 2-day siege, November 19th through 21, 1775. When the Loyalist leaders realized that Richardson is on his way with 4,000 men, they approached Williamson and say, hey, you know, we need to do a truce. See, Williamson did not know that the relief force was on the way. And so Williamson and the Patriots and Patrick Cunningham and Richard Paris made an agreement so that the Patriots would tear down the fort they had made, and the Loyalists would retreat across the river. And Patrick Cunningham, in the meantime, he's still in possession of the shot and powder. So he goes to the most wildest and remote place that he could possibly think of, which is in Greenville County, South Carolina, just over the Cherokee Territory line. It's on the banks of the Reedy River in a massive canebrake. Well, when Richard Richardson gets on the scene, the Loyalists tell him, hey, we got a treaty, it was a truce, you know, you can turn around and go home now. And Richard Richardson says, I didn't agree to any truce, I didn't agree to that. So he continued on, and he starts arresting other Loyalist leaders in the backcountry. And he's encamped in Hollingsworth Mill in Lawrence County when he gets word that Patrick Cunningham and 270 men are at the Great Canebrake on the banks of the Reedy. And when he gets that word, and this is in December 21st of 1775, he sends Danger Thompson on an overnight mission up the banks of the Reedy with 1,300 men. And they get to the canebrake and start to surround Cunningham. And right before the encirclement is complete, the guards notice the activity and they start shooting. And the camp is awakened. Patrick Cunningham sticks his head out the flap of his tent. He sees the Patriot militia in the surrounding hills, and he yells out, shift for yourself. And he jumps on his horse bareback, and he heads further up the Reedy River, deeper into Cherokee territory. Some say he was bare breeches as well. But he got away. 70 of his men got away. It was 130 of his men were captured here at the canebrake. And that was on the morning of December 22nd. It was bitterly cold. This battle happened at dawn. As soon as all 130 prisoners had their hands tied and bound behind their backs, it started to snow. And it started to snow like it's never snowed in Greenville County since. It snowed for 30 hours. The snow was 18 inches deep. Many of these men were barefoot. And the last hour and a half of that snow, it was a blinding sleet. And that's why this entire series of campaigns here is referred to as the Snow Campaign. And those men were sent on a 2-week march down into South Carolina, down the Cherokee Trail, down the Cherokee Path, down to Charleston, where they were put in captivity for the next several months until they signed an oath saying that they would never fight again. So that's the Snow Campaign. And what the Snow Campaign did was break the loyalist, influence in the back country. The loyalists knew then, they started leaving wholeheartedly. Many of the loyalists went into Cherokee territory. Cherokees welcomed them. Many went down to Florida. Some went up north and started fighting with the British forces in the north. But, and many of the loyalist supporters, went to ground. I believe that it was divided 50-50 between patriots and loyalists in the back country, but many folks say that it was divided, 1/3 were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 just absolutely did not care. Or that third was whoever they thought was going to win. And the fortunes in South Carolina flipped back and forth and back and forth. There was more activity in South Carolina than anywhere else, and it was extremely violent. This was a civil war. The Snow Campaign was South Carolinian against South Carolinian. There were 750 North Carolinians who came down on horses. All of those men went to the Battle of Canebrake. But this was the ultimate civil war that was occurring here. This is the site of the Battle of the Great Canebrake. What you see, these trees are pecan trees that were planted by the Hopkins family in 1876. Those trees are 146 years old. There's only 8 of them living now. Most of these are still standing, but there's only 8 living. So, that was the Snow Campaign. And that controlled loyalist activity in the backcountry. But the British definitely had their eyes on South Carolina, and they had their eyes on Charleston. Charleston was the richest city in America during this time. And so what the plan was is that Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis would come south with 3,000 troops and 9 British ships of the line, an armada of 9 British ships. So the people of South Carolina were, creating their defenses. They had a Fort Johnson over here that was guarding one side of the Charleston Harbor, but a little unfinished fort here called Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, opposed by the 9 British ships here. And Moultrie had 31 cannons as opposed to Admiral Peter Parker's 260 naval guns. And actually I read Parker had more than that. There were about 10 times more guns. So the British came down, and their idea was that they were going to blast past or just, destroy the fort here, and then they would be able to sail unopposed into Charleston Harbor. So they came down to this area and they anchored in opposition to the Palmetto Log Fort. In the meantime, Clinton and Cornwallis land up here on the Isle of Palms. And they've got 3,000 men. And their idea is that they're going to land on the Isle of Palms and then march right across Breach Inlet and take Fort Moultrie from behind. And their information was that Breach Inlet was 18 inches deep at low tide. And everybody from South Carolina knows good and well that Breach Inlet is never more shallow than 7 feet deep. And that's with a strong riptide coming through. This is where the Hunley was launched from during the Civil War. So Thompson's this is our man, Danger Thompson. Okay? He's here with 780 men opposing Clinton and Cornwallis' 3,000, and those men cannot get across Breach Inlet, and they are totally out of the fight. And in the meantime, Moultrie with Francis Marion manning his artillery is blasting the absolute hell out of this British Armada. William Campbell, the royal governor, and Peter Parker are standing side by side when a cannonball blasts through and wounds Governor Campbell so seriously that he dies as a result. And Admiral Peter Parker gets a 3-foot splinter about that big right in his rear end. And that's how that battle went for the British, and it was a terrible defeat. So this happened on June 28th, 1776, Carolina Day. Now, as many dates as I throw out, doesn't matter to me if you remember them or not. There's 2 dates I want you to remember. One of them is June 28th, 1776. It's Carolina Day, and we celebrate that every year here in South Carolina. Superb victory that kept the British out of South Carolina for the next 4 years. Now, the other date I want you to remember is May the 12th, 1780, and that's the day that Charleston fell, which is, you know, a very dark time in South Carolina history. Here, Sergeant Jasper reestablishing the flag that got shot in half. You know, the British thought that that was a capitulation when the flag went down, that Sergeant Jasper jumped up and started waving it on a swabber from a cannon. Why this flag is not shown as indigo blue, I have no idea. Because we all know that the flag that William Moses flew then was a crescent on a blue field, a crescent on a blue field, and it was indigo blue, and it was a crescent. It was not a crescent moon. It was not a gorget. He distinctly described it. It is a crescent on a blue field. So, during the time that the British were planning their attack on the coast of South Carolina, there was also a movement afoot to have the Native Americans uprise along the western front. Now, there's some discussion that says, oh, the British agents, John Stuart and Alexander Cameron, they were fomenting this uprising. Now, the letters from the time between the two discouraged that. However, there was one letter that was published everywhere saying that the British wanted to, you know, arm the Cherokees and all this kind of stuff, signed on the bottom John Stuart. But there's significant evidence that that letter was a fraud. So we don't know. We do know that John Stuart did discourage the Cherokees in numerous ways from going on the warpath because he knew what was going to happen. And what did happen was a serious, serious thing for the Cherokees. But also, the Shawnees from the Ohio area, they definitely sent a delegation down to the Cherokees, meeting with them, trying to encourage the Cherokees to go on the warpath. And, you know, the idea was that there would be a 2-front campaign with the Cherokees and the Patriots in the center, you know, being diluted on, their strength being diluted on both ends. So, let me go here. In June of 1776, there was the Hampton Massacre. And this happened on the border between Greenville and Charleston in Spartanburg counties, where Anthony Hampton had a plantation. Anthony Hampton was General Wade Hampton's great-grandfather. And Anthony Hampton had 4 sons who fought in the Revolution. He had a 5th son, Preston, who was a Cherokee trader. And some claim that Preston may have been an unfair trader. There's so many different conflicting reports, and I'll give you the differences in those reports and let you decide. some people say Preston was a peacemaker. And of course, if you were a bad trader, you'd want to be a peacemaker. But anyway, Anthony Hampton was at home. He looked up and he saw a group of Cherokees on the tree line there, and it was individuals that he had recognized. And so he went out to greet them, and Preston was at his side. And as Anthony Hampton was shaking hands with the leading man, a shot rang out, and it hit Preston right in the chest and killed him instantly. And as that occurred, the Cherokee that Anthony Hampton was shaking his hand, he was shaking with one hand, he took the other hand and hit him in the head with a tomahawk and killed him dead right there. Now, there were several women and children who were at the residence. The women were killed. There was a 11-month-old infant who was swollen by the ankles and had his head bashed in against the side of the house. There were 2 children between the ages of 5 and 10. The Cherokees kidnapped them. If a child was less than 5, they would be killed, or more than 10, they would be killed. But they would bring these 5 to 10-year-olds into their tribe and raise them as Cherokees. One of the survivors of the Long Cane Massacre in 1761, she was kidnapped and lived as a Cherokee for the next 12 years of her life, and she had to be convinced to come back into European civilization. And one of these 8-year-old boys who was kidnapped, 2 years later, when Andrew Pickens was negotiating his release, that kid didn't want to leave either. So I don't know what that says. But, so, that's what happened at the Anthony Hampton plantation. The Cherokees then went to Preston Hampton's home, where his children were out playing in the yard, and his wife was out in the woods coming home. And she witnessed what happened next. And her 7 and 8-year-old children, they were killed. And Mrs. Preston Hampton witnessed that. And Mrs. Hampton went into a severe shock, and they say she never spoke for the rest of her life. So, you know, that was an incident that occurred. July the 15th, 1776. This is 6 weeks after the Hampton Massacre. The settlers at this time went to the backcountry forts for protection because they knew that the Cherokees were on the warpath. The location of one of these forts is just inside this tree line. And this is where Fort Lindley was. And this is another site where I'm the caretaker. And the Tories in the backcountry who had gone into Cherokee territory during the Snow Campaign were fomenting unrest with the Cherokees. They were gathering at Richard Parris's house right there at the Reading River Falls. And they were doing raids into the South Carolina backcountry along the border of Cherokee territory. And 61 settlers were killed. There was a sister fort to Fort Lindley. It's called Kellett's Blockhouse. At Kellett's Blockhouse, there was a fellow who wrote his pension application, Matthew Brown. He was stationed at Kellett's Blockhouse for a month. And he had his job, his job was to bury dead settlers. And he buried 31 of them between 10 miles on either side of his fort. Because if there was another fort closer by, they would be the ones who buried those backcountry settlers. So Matthew Brown got word that Fort Lindley was going to be attacked on the night of July the 15th, 1776. The garrison from Kellett's Blockhouse comes. Jonathan Downs and the Little River Regiment is staying here on their way to join up with Andrew Williamson. There's 150 defenders of this fort with women and children. It was a fortified home. It had defensive trenches all the way around it. Those trenches are still visible today. We don't know if it was a palisaded walls or stockade walls. We're going to find out shortly. I just got news on my way here that the archaeologist is finally going to meet with me Monday morning at this fort to do archaeological survey here. And it's a top-notch guy, a leader in the field. I'm telling you folks, leaders in the field are from South Carolina. We have the best archaeological work in the nation. And I'm proud to say that. But we have more battle sites than anywhere in the nation. There's over 200 in South Carolina. And there's over 100 from 50 miles from where we are right here. We'll talk about a number of them tonight. But Fort Lindley, 30, 40 miles from right here. At midnight of that night, 102 Scofielites and 88 Cherokees surrounded that fort. Now, Scofielite is described as a European man who dressed as a Cherokee. And that's what the Boston Tea Party was. That's what the Charleston Tea Party was. Europeans dressed as Cherokees in order to throw off, and the Cherokees always got the blame for no matter what happened. But those men surrounded this fort and a brisk 2-hour gunfight erupted. After about 2 hours, the defenders of that fort had enough. They threw open the gates of the fort and charged out 10 abreast. One thing about fighting the Cherokees, they have no unit cohesion. You charge them, they run. They don't stand. They don't have commanding officers. The Cherokees believed in absolute total freedom. One man could not tell another what to do. And this was a very poor system in battle. But you charge them and they retreat, and the experienced Indian fighters knew that. And I could talk all hour about Fort Lindley. But go on to Seneca. This is Lake Harbor. Seneca was in the bottom of this lake. This was the closest town to the European settlers, and it was a staging ground for Cherokee raids into the back country. And there were 2 battles at Seneca. Major Danger Thompson was the leader. Here is Danger Thompson. He's at Canebrake, December 22nd. June 28th, he's at Sullivan's Island. August the 1st, he's now leading the column at Seneca. And this is where Francis Salvador, the first Jewish American to be elected to public office in America, was also the first Jewish American to die in the Patriot cause in America. He died at the bottom of that lake right there, scalped alive. This is where the ring fight occurred. This is where Andrew Pickens was destroying the town of Tomasi, and a lone Cherokee warrior jumped up and started running through a field, probably in this exact location. We don't know for sure. And as he's running into the middle of the field, Andrew Pickens says to his 25 men, hey, we got to go get that guy. And he's chasing right after him. And when Pickens and his men get right here in the middle, all of a sudden, 185 Cherokee warriors rise from the 3-foot-tall grass. It was an abandoned agricultural field. And there is Andrew Pickens absolutely surrounded by these 185 Cherokees. So he arranges his men in 2 concentric rings. And this has forevermore been described as the ring fight. He had 12 men on the inner line. They would be loading, while the 13 men on the outer line would be firing. The outer line would load, the inner load would fire, and so forth. That's how he fought off these men for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Andrew Pickens was one of the most active soldiers in the Revolution. And he says this is the most intensive fighting of his entire career. And after an hour and 15 minutes, his brother Joseph Pickens comes on the scene with the police force. Robert Anderson, who's his second in command, Anderson County, Anderson City, named after Robert Anderson. Oh, he comes on the scene, and Jonathan Downs of the Little River Regiment comes on the scene away as well. And that battle is broken. So now I'll show you this map. This just showed there were 16 towns in Pickens and Oconee counties. And during the Cherokee War of 1776, every one of these was absolutely razed and destroyed. All the homes were burned, the fields, trampled down, the orchards cut down. Just like in the first Cherokee War, which actually took 3 years from start to finish. The Patriots got the word about how to fight Cherokees during this time, and this war lasted 3 months. And now the Cherokees were totally chastised. They were driven into the mountains with just the clothes on their backs to survive the winter. A band of 200 Cherokees walked down through Creek territory. Now, the Creeks were absolute enemies with the Cherokees. They had a lot of animosity towards each other. But the Creek leaders allowed these 200 Cherokees to walk through their territory all the way down to Pensacola, where John Stewart, the British agent, was. And they were going down there to get help, just walking with clothes on their back. By the time they got to Pensacola, these 200 Cherokees were absolutely naked. They had to trade their clothes for food. They could not survive. They were the most pathetic, destitute group of individuals you could possibly see. And the Creeks were like, you see what happens if we go to war with these guys. So the Creeks remained neutral, pretty much, even though there's several times when they did help the Loyalists as well. But that's why the Creeks allowed those Cherokees to walk through their territory. There were a total of 32 towns that were destroyed. Colonel Jack from Georgia destroyed Cherokee towns in Georgia. Griffith, Rutherford, and Charles McDowell from North Carolina came through, destroyed Middletown Cherokee towns. There was a command from Virginia who came through and attacked the Overhill Cherokees. It was absolute decimation for the Cherokees. There were 2,000 Rerokees shot on sight in the Cherokee War of 1776. It was the greatest massacre in the Revolutionary War. And that happened right here. So, that's part of the history of this area. In the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner in 1776, this boundary line was established. And I wonder, here's Fort Prince George, here's Keowee, here's the Seneca, Escatoy. That's a beautiful spot. I tell you what, the Cherokees had the most beautiful places in the world to create their towns, because this is prime South Carolina scenery right here. Tougaloo, several incidents happened there as well, particularly incidents with the Creeks. That's where they're faced with the Creeks. This was the original line set up in 1777 with the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner, which opened up Anderson, Greenville, Pickens, and Oconee counties to settlement at that time. In 1860, the boundary line of South Carolina was moved back to the Continental Divide. This is when the United States government bought this area from the Cherokees in the Treaty of Washington in 1816 for $5 million. And that comes out to 10 cents an acre, which really was not a bad price during that Where I live in the 1950s, land was selling for 50 cents an acre. I wish I thought about it. So, you know, that's what was happening in South Carolina. I mean, once the snow campaign was over with, and once the Cherokee War of 1776 was over with, there, the Patriots had established dominance over the two groups that they feared the most, that, you know, they were in opposition to. And it was peaceful in the backcountry of South Carolina for years. Thomas Sumter got so bored that he retired, and he went back to running his store in the high hills of the Santee. But what was going on in the rest of America? And this is a map, you know, showing the activity and the battles in the United States. And look, you know, at all South Carolina's got here. And there's not one single mention of the Cherokee War of 1776, so you could add 16 more right there, and there's a bunch of stuff left out. Now, if you'll look, no activity here. None in Maryland whatsoever. None in western Pennsylvania. This area right here was relatively safe during the Revolutionary War. That was the breadbasket of the Patriot forces during the Revolutionary War. This is where the prison camps were. Charlottesville had the prisoners from Saratoga. There were several prison camps in Western Virginia. There was one at Point Lookout, Maryland. No battles in Maryland. I tell you what, though, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Maryland regiments. I've talked about this before. I mean, again, but the Maryland and Delaware regiments just really did good when they came down and fought in South Carolina. And we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. So now, in the North, there were four major campaigns. There was the Boston campaign. That was a 10-month siege. George Washington won that when the guns from Ticonderoga were placed on Dorchester Hill overnight, and the British saw those guns frowning down on them and said, "Oh, we better sail away." So they sailed away to Newfoundland, and that was a victory. There was another campaign going on while the snow campaign was going on here in South Carolina. And this is the Canadian campaign. Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, along with General Richard Montgomery, took Montreal without a problem. Then they went to attack Quebec. Daniel Morgan got into the center of the town with 400 men. Richard Montgomery, who would have been one of our greatest generals, if not our greatest, I mean, he had incredible respect, but he was killed immediately at the Battle of Quebec, and the attack fell down, and Daniel Morgan got captured. He was later exchanged. So the Quebec, the Canadian campaign was a disaster. And soon thereafter, Johnny Burgoyne came into Quebec with 6,500 British regulars. So after that, there was a series of battles around New York. The British had landed in Newfoundland after Boston. They regrouped, and then they came down and they attacked at New York City. Sorry, there were 4 battles around New York, and George Washington got whipped at every single one of them. And he barely got out of the skin of his teeth with his army. So New York had fallen and would stay under British control until 1783. But George Washington, while he gave up New York, he kept his army. So then, the plan was that John Burgoyne and his 6,500 men would come down through the backcountry of New York, and there was supposed to be a force from over here join up with Burgoyne. And General Howe from New York was supposed to join up with Burgoyne, and they were going to create, you know, a line right here that would totally break Patriot communications. Well, there were the Howe brothers. One general was commanding the army, and the other general was the other admiral. The other Howe was the admiral. I can't remember which is which, but General Howe was supposed to go up and meet with Burgoyne. But for some unexplained reason, he decides to go capture Philadelphia instead. So during this campaign, George Washington lost 3 battles as Howe was approaching Philadelphia, and George Washington lost all those 3 battles. And that's when he went into winter camp in Valley Forge. But in the meantime, as Burgoyne was coming down from New York, from Canada, into the wilds of New York, all of a sudden, his group that was supposed to join him from this area, there's nobody there. Howe, there's nobody there. And Burgoyne has outrun his supply lines, and he's stuck in the middle of the wilderness. And Horatio Gates and his Continental Army, along with Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, they surround and attack Burgoyne. And there's 2 battles at the Battle of Saratoga. We're talking about Saratoga in the summer of 1777. Now, one thing that is so odd to me is the fact that the battles per se that were happening down here did not affect the battles per se that were happening up here, and vice versa. You know, these were totally 2 different theaters of war. But what did affect what happened in South Carolina very much was the victory at the Battle of Saratoga. And in Saratoga, that's when the French joined forces with the Americans. Now, you have to realize that the Revolutionary War, I talk about how it's a civil war in South Carolina, but the Revolutionary War was a world war because England, Britain had tons of enemies. Everybody hated the British. While the Revolutionary War was going on, 1/2 of their fleet was battling with the Spaniards in not Malta, but in the Mediterranean there. So there was a major conflict going on involving half the British might and power at the entrance to the Mediterranean. At the same time, that leaves 50% of their force. 25% of their force is now guarding the Caribbean islands because the Spaniards are threatening from the south. And the Spaniards were in New Orleans at this time. What this map doesn't show is right over here in Pensacola was the 2nd biggest land battle in the Revolution. And this was in 1782, but there were 8,000 Spanish troops who captured 2,000 British in Pensacola during this time. That was a huge battle, and it's hardly even mentioned. But Britain had a lot on their plate, and they only had 25% of their navy that was the strongest in the world, but they only had 25% able to execute what happened in the Revolutionary War. So when Saratoga fell, this had a change in British strategy. And Howe, who had 12,000 troops in Philadelphia, was ordered to abandon Philadelphia and take 5,000 of his troops and send them to New York. and he was ordered to take another 5,000 of his troops and send them to the Caribbean. And he was ordered to take the remaining 2,000 troops and take them all the way around from Philadelphia to Pensacola. And that weakened the British forces, quite a bit. And as Howe was leaving Philadelphia, up here, that's when Washington broke camp from Valley Forge, and this is the summer of 1778, and he attacked Howe as he was crossing the Delaware River. And Howe was astraddle the river. He had half his force on one side and half on the other side. And that's where you want to catch an army. That is exactly where you want to catch them. So Washington charges forth, and this is the Battle of Monmouth. And Charles Lee, who was a retired British general who came to the American side and thought he was smarter than George Washington and everything, until Bannister Tarleton captured him in a house of ill repute, but I'll talk about that later. Charles Lee, rather than dress home the attack, for some reason decides to retreat, and the Battle of Monmouth wound up in a draw. And that was the last major battle that was in the North. And this is in the summer of 1778, when the war is continuing on for 4 more years. But it was an absolute stalemate in the North. So while that was going on, there was hardly anything going on in the South, except that Florida was being a real pain. And the Loyalists in Florida formed the Florida Rangers. They were raiding into Georgia. There were 3 campaigns, 1776, 77, and 78, down into quell the activity in Florida, and every one of them was absolutely ineffective. Waste of time. Florida was a constant thorn in the side for the Patriot forces. Until the British finally got a toehold in the South. And the way they did this was through attacking Savannah. And on December 29th in 1778, they sent a force under Archibald Campbell to land on Tybee Island and oppose the colonial defenders of Savannah. Now, at the same time, Augustine Prevost was supposed to come with his army, which is at St. Augustine, marching overland through Georgia and Florida. And this is very rough terrain, very rough. This is what gave them so much fits. Augustine and his men, Augustine Prevost and his men were very tardy in getting to Savannah. But Archibald Campbell, when he had landed there, he got word from an enslaved person that while that rice field seemed impenetrable right in front of him, there was a footpath where he could go around and get behind the Patriot forces. So Campbell did that, and he took the Patriot forces, and Savannah fell on December 28th, December 29th, 1778. Well, now the British have a port here in the South, and that gave encouragement to the Loyalists in the back country. And a fellow named John Boyd gathered up an army, a group of Loyalists from the back country, and starts marching down because he's going to join up with Augustine Prevost's brother, Mark Prevost, in Augusta. So Savannah, Georgia at this time had only 2 towns, Savannah and Augusta. Augustine's brother Mark, he moves up through to Augusta because he's been told that he's going to meet 1,000 Creek warriors there, and that's why he's there. John Boyd and his men want to join up with this group as well. Well, when John Boyd comes through, 600 or 700 Loyalists, he starts to be monitored, opposed, and chased by Andrew Pickens and Robert Anderson. And this is Andrew Pickens' only first sole command of an expedition. And this is where he showed his brilliance as a military leader. So he caught up with Boyd and his men at a place called Kettle Creek that looks surprisingly like Kings Mountain. But half of the loyalists had crossed the creek, and on the other side of the creek, they were astraddle the creek, and they were butchering cattle for breakfast on the other side, when Pickens and 300 men, along with Elijah Clark and John Dooley, Georgia patriots, they attack Boyd's 600 men on top of that hill. John Boyd is killed early on in that battle. It's a complete rout. Pickens captures and wounds and kills at least half of that army. 270 of those men do get away, and they come down to Augusta, and they think finally they're going to be meeting with Mark Prevost. Well, when they get there, Prevost has already left because no Creeks showed up. The Creeks never even got the word that they were supposed to show up. So that was just a wasted trip. So then Prevost and his men start coming along the south bank of the Savannah River, the west bank. This is like a chess game that occurs now. Benjamin Lincoln is the Patriot commander in Charleston. He knows that Mark Prevost is there and Augustine Prevost is here, so he's worried about the two of them, so he moves about 2,500 men to Perrysburg on the Savannah. He fears he can go this way or he can go that way. Of course, the Savannah is a big obstacle to cross. He did have 1,100 men under John Ash, a general from North Carolina, cross probably at Augusta and start following Prevost and his men until they get to Briar Creek. Briar Creek, when he comes into the Savannah, there was a bridge there that the British burned. So then John Ash and his men are sitting here getting ready to force a crossing of the creek there. But in the meantime, Archibald Campbell sends his men, or Mark Prevost sends his men around to attack the Patriots on the flank. And this is a terrible Patriot defeat at Briar Creek. Henry Clinton landed 8,000 men on the north bank of the Edstone River right here, and slowly made his way up through Charleston, surrounded Charleston, besieged Charleston, and Charleston surrendered on May 12th of 1780. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the beginning of our next program, but for now I think I've pretty much run out of time. And I wanted y'all to know about some field trips this weekend. So I use these lectures to discuss events that occur before the various field trips. And on Sunday or Saturday at 10 o'clock, we're going to go on a field trip to 4 battle sites in Spartanburg County. 4 battles that pushed British lines back 40 miles. And that was territory that the British never recovered. We'll look at Fort Gowan, Earl's Ford, Shiloh Church, and Fort Prince. We will travel in convoy. So that's always an interesting trip. And then on Sunday at 2 o'clock, we'll tour the battlefield at Kings Mountain. And you know what a momentous battle that was. We'll probably be on the battlefield 2 hours. We'll walk the entire route, and we'll be looking at what happened there in detail. And that was quite an incredible battle. So does anybody have any questions at this point?
Where do you meet on the Arts?
Where we meet at, on Saturday is at the Redeemed Church,
Oh,
1000 South Blackstock Road in Landrum. Blackstock Road runs all the way through Spartanburg County, I'm sure it's South Blackstock and Landrum.
The ring battle,
Yes,
was that a standard maneuver, or did they just develop that process?
that was impromptu. The plan is never to be surrounded, so they didn't practice that much. But, that was just something we came up with immediately. It's a beautiful site there. Yes.
Going back to Port Charlotte, where was that located?
It's in McCormick County on the, Savannah River. Right now, it's under Lake Trumbull.
I think,
Yeah. So what the British did was they had, Fort Charlotte on this side of Savannah and Fort James was on the other side. Right here. And the idea was that Fort James would keep the Cherokees from coming into Georgia, and Fort Charlotte would keep the Creeks from coming into South Carolina. And that was the arrangement they had. Well, if nobody has any other questions, sorry I ran over a little bit, but, yes,
How did the council say this?
they just met in the library somewhere and said, we can run things better than William Campbell can. They were members of the Commons House of Assembly, which was the governing body, similar to Parliament. And they had the power to raise taxes within the colony. Now, the governor could impose taxes, but if you wanted to raise taxes to support a militia or something like that, the Council of Commons House of Assembly would pass that law. Then the Privy Council would look at it. They had power of veto, and the governor had veto power. And there were such, well, the Commons House of Assembly voted to send like 10,000 pounds to England to defend John Wilkes, who John Wilkes Booth was named after. John Wilkes was on trial for speaking too freely, freedom of speech. So they sent 10% of the South Carolina budget to England for this guy's defense. And the government was like, you can't do that, you can't. This was like 1771. And there was such an impasse over that, there was no further laws passed for the next 5 years. And the Council of Safety, just like the group right here, got together, even though there was only about 5 or 10 of them. And they were an extra legal body. And there were numerous extra legal bodies during this time because they made it so hot for the governor, he couldn't stay in Charleston. He had to go to Washington. So that's how they get started. They appointed themselves. Yes.
You mentioned that you're going to meet the archaeologists at some point.
Yeah.
And I think you said you're a caretaker.
Yes.
Can you tell us what it means to be a caretaker?
It means that I get rid of weeds. You know, we are in the process of discovering so many historic sites. You know, we found Hammond's old store 13 months ago. We found the site of Dunlop's defeat in Donald, South Carolina, 2 months ago. We're right now looking for the site of Fort Williams on the Newberry-Lawrence County line. Fort Williams changed hands more than any place in America. 6 times. It was occupied 3 times. Nathaniel Greene camped his army there after he broke off the siege in 96. And we don't know where Fort Williams was. But through the use of metal detecting and LIDAR, we are really able to identify where these battles occurred. We can see where the colonial roads were. And that's, so crucial to the battle. LIDAR is what is discovering all these artifacts in Egypt. You know, there's a discovery after discovery coming out of Egypt these days. It's causing LIDAR. And that's how we're finding South Carolina battlefield as well.
Sir, what is that?
It's radar. It's like ground penetrating radar in a way. The entire state of South Carolina has been LIDAR. But it's a specialized technique. Now, I do not know. If somebody tells me this is what you see on LIDAR, I'm, oh yeah, I see that, yeah. But I have to be told. But you can get a program and you can figure out how to use it, and you can set that reading level to whatever height you want. That's one reason, way that foresters measure the tops of trees, how tall they are. And you can set it to be at ground level, or you can set it to be at 6 inches below ground or wherever, and ground disturbances show up. It's pretty incredible. That's all I know about it.
Well, that's more than I knew.
I just hang out with these guys, and I do write up their findings, and I think that's one reason they let me tag along. But I mean, this is super. Yes.
Excuse me, is that how they found the 14 soldiers they're going to bury at?
You know, I think every time I ask that question, what I hear is, we've always known where they were.
Okay,
I don't know.
so they're just going to relocate them.
Yeah, you know, they're gonna give them a place of honor. They were only buried like 6 inches deep.
They're gonna be reburied right where they were.
Oh, are they? Okay. Now, I've got a confusion about the date.
Yeah.
Is it April 22nd or March 22nd?
Hey.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, folks.